through it, you just turn the crank here. Voila, instant air conditioning. Look at that. Another episode of Jay Leno's Garage, Pandemic Edition. This is another one of these. I'm kind of here by myself and just picking cars out of the collection I thought you might enjoy. This is one we have not featured before. We featured it on my CNBC show, but not on YouTube, where we go into a little bit more depth. It is a 1934 Chrysler Airflow Imperial, or Chrysler Imperial Airflow, whichever you want to go, CX model. Very rare car. There are only 3 of these left in the world. The CX was not quite the top of the line. Top of the line was the CW, which was also LeBaron bodied, a little bigger, a little wider. Every part of it was different. Those were truly hand-built. And ironically, there are more of those that survived than these. I like the CX model because the windshield's open. Well, I'll show you. You'll see why it's called the Airflow in just a few minutes. This car was not a big success. It was revolutionary. You know, most cars built in this period, the early 30s, still had a lot of wood in the roof and in the framing. This was all steel. Pretty amazing automobile. All kinds of room inside this thing. The engine was pushed forward over the front axle, and so you got a lot more leg room. You actually sat down in the car instead of sitting on the rear differential like you did in most cars. So it gave that sort of boulevard ride which these became famous for. 3-speed transmission with an overdrive. Let's start with the engine, which is a flathead. Not particularly exotic, just a standard flathead, 299 cubic inches, about 122 horsepower, something like that. Let's open the hood and show you what this looks like. Nothing particularly exotic. You know, when you look at the Duesenberg from this period with 4 valves per cylinder, twin overhead camshafts, very exotic. This is just, well, a good old girl, actually, a very dependable, very reliable, very quiet, didn't leak oil. Not the most powerful thing out there, but powerful enough. You could go 70 on the freeway in this, no problem, with 3 or 4 people aboard. 2-barrel carburetor, as I said, about 122 horsepower. The interesting thing is, you see the engine is forward over the front axle just to give you more footroom in the cabin, which is sort of revolutionary. And of course, the streamlined design, which was so far ahead of its time. You know, it was sort of like the shock of the new, in the sense that you can't sell something before its time. Because prior to this, luxury cars had looked really imposing with big grills, like this Duesenberg, like this Packard, you know, big front end that would sort of, so powerful, it could push the wind aside, you know, all that kind of nonsense. Whereas this was actually streamlined, and a lot of thought went into the streamlining. In fact, the Wright brothers, I think Orville Wright, had a hand in helping Chrysler develop a very crude at the time wind tunnel, so they could get the design down and streamlined. Because see, prior to this, there was a man named Paul Jouret and a guy named Rumpler, Jouret also helped design the Tatra T87, which we've done previously on this broadcast. They found that aerodynamically a teardrop was perfect, wide at the front and then tapering to the back. But back in the day, most cars were skinny in the front and then tapered out and wide at the back, very Kardashian-like, if you will, to make it more appealing for the passengers. You know, you want it wide where the passengers are going to sit. And so consequently, it was found when they tested most cars in the 20s and 30s were more aerodynamic going backwards than they were going forwards, because the front end was actually tapered. So this sort of turns that whole thing on its ear. Paul Jouret eventually sued Chrysler because he felt a lot of his ideas had been pirated. And I think he won something like $40,000, which in 1930 something was a lot of money. That was, I mean, figure a house was $8,500, something like that, maybe $5,000 for a house. So $40,000 is a good deal of change. But that shows you the front end. Radiator obviously way up front. But see, normally the engine would be here and protruding more into the passenger. compartment. Here it's hanging right over the front axle, which gives you a lot more leg room. You'll see, notice the steering column right here comes all the way forward, so when you're in the car, you don't hit your feet on the steering column when you're trying to press the brake. This Waterfall Grill was probably the most controversial part of the vehicle. 34 was the first year, and it had the most number of slats, and then to save money they cut down on the number of slats, and then eventually just put a conventional front end on it because it just looked odd to people. It didn't look like the expensive other cars of the period, the Cadillacs, the Pierce Arrows, the Lincolns, all those cars. So that's another reason for its downfall. Also, it was a new way of making automobiles. It was, as I said before, it was all steel. There were a lot of teething problems in the process. So consequently, people ordered cars. They didn't get them at the time they should, so they canceled and bought something else. There were just a number of reasons for the downfall, but mostly it was the styling. People, it sort of looked like the Santa Fe Express or one of those trains, you know. It just didn't knock people out. To me, it sort of looks like the Scout Scarab, which was a car built by a guy named Stout, who was another aeronautical guy. There's only one or two of those available. Let's move down here. Here's kind of the cool part of this car. When you open both doors, you enter a world of luxury. I mean, this thing sort of looks like the Chrysler building in New York, and it's very Art Deco. Look how much room you've got. These here for your feet. It's almost, well, it almost is a limousine. It looks like a limousine. Now here's one of the coolest features of the Airflow. The window goes down and the vent window opens. Get air flowing that way. What's that you say? You want more air? Okay. You can put the window up, flip that, and the whole window goes down. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah, sure, look at that. And this back seat is a very comfortable place to read your Chrysler Imperial Airflow instruction manual. And this is the days when they actually told you how to do stuff, how to adjust valves. You know, modern cars, oh, I want to put the radio on. See your dealer. Ask your, you know. Whereas this, they explain everything, electrical system, brakes, shocks, how to adjust the brakes, lubrication chart. You got everything in here, which is pretty cool. So that makes it kind of fun. Sometimes if you're on a budget, it's fun to collect the manuals as much fun as to collect the cars. But as you can see, we've got, this has got the footrest in here to brace yourself. I mean, this is almost like a minivan inside here. You've got so much room, and you've got these outside little windows here, which are just fantastic. You can open those as well. And I'll show you in just a minute how the windshield opens up, so the air actually flows through the car, hence the name Airflow. There's almost a flat floor here. Not quite, even though it's rear drive. All kinds of room. I mean, this is a really comfortable car to take a trip in. I've driven this thing, you know, 150 miles at a shot, and it's great. It's really an incredible automobile. You've got, everyone has their own cigarette lighter, and of course, ashtray, you know. And you can even open this rear window here. So you just turn that little crank and you got air flowing all over this thing. It's fantastic. Who needs air conditioning? Okay, here we are inside the vehicle. Very pretty dashboard, as you can see. Another reason it's called the Airflow, this is very cool. You can actually open both windscreens. Let's give this. And they open pretty wide, as you can see. So you get all kinds of air flowing through here. Don't forget, when this car was designed, the speed limit was 45 miles an hour. So that gave you a nice breeze through here. You know, at 70 or 80, it might get a bit intrusive. And both sides open, which is pretty cool, as you can see. Okay, let's close that up. Okay, you've got a glove box here. and a glove box on that side as well. Starter button, headlights. I believe this is an ashtray, but mine doesn't seem to have an ashtray. Maybe they didn't get it on this one. This is your overdrive. This is your hand throttle, speedometer, of course, tripometer, your various gauges, ammeters, oil pressure, gas, and of course the temperature. And this is your instrument panel lights. This, oddly enough, is the radio, which is kind of cool, as you can see, a little tiny radio in there, but a huge, massive thing under the seat with tubes and all kinds of stuff. You've got electric cigarette lighter. You can also open these. Can you see these vents here? Just open from the windshield. So you can air to your feet, air to your face. They don't call this baby the Airflow for nothing. Handbrake. And of course your 3-speed gear shift. Something which is very unusual in a car of this period. Notice there's no steering column between the clutch and the brake. So you don't hit your feet on there. And you've got all kinds of room here. This is individual windshield wipers. You can just run one wiper if you want. And of course you've got these visors here. Beautiful upholstered roof. A horn. There you go. Steering wheel. A nice car to drive. This thing just sort of commands down the road. I mean, it really drives like a much later car than 1934 because it was truly a modern automobile, automobile ahead of its time. Not so much in the engine and design as much as the overall outside design of the car, the way it was manufactured. The engine is pretty traditional. It's just a big straight 8, very reliable, very dependable, you know, just the right amount of horsepower. That was with the Duesenberg, all the engineering is in the motor. In this, all the engineering and science is in the aerodynamics and the suspension and making it ride comfortable. You actually sit between the axles, which makes it really nice. Come on, let's take a look at the outside of the car. I'll take you around the back. Well, here we are at the rear of the vehicle. If you're wondering why it has such tremendous leg room, it's because there's no trunk. This is pretty much, if you could afford one of these, you had another guy with another car following you with all your luggage. That's pretty much the way it worked. You had your spare tire back here and, of course, your gas tank. You know, the Airflow Club is terrific. They've got all the information on these cars. And a fountain of knowledge. If you find one of these, they're still pretty reasonably priced. You can find them, like everything else, they're going up in value. My friend Bruce Wallen has just been great and very helpful. And the club will help anybody at any time. You know, they're always looking for members. So if you find these types of vehicles interesting, well, they're interesting and reasonably affordable, which I think is terrific. The later Airflows after 34 are much more reasonable because they became much more traditional looking. They put a traditional front end on it. You know, a lot of companies did that. Franklin, the air-cooled car company, they never had a radiator. And when they built a more high-end Franklin, it didn't look like anything else. So they went and quickly put what looked like a radiator on the front of it, and it kind of neither fish nor fowl, and it didn't really work. You know, I wish they had just stuck to their roots. This is the only year of that Waterfall Grill and that Waterfall front end. The rest of the cars stay pretty much. So from 35 on, you can find Airflows fairly reasonable if it's something you're interested in. The nice thing about them, they're just so dependable. You know, you can drive them anywhere. A flathead, you can run it today as a modern car. I mean, I take this on the freeway. I used to drive it to work all the time. And people just go, they just think it's the most amazing looking thing because it does sort of look like a minivan. When you look at the 34 Airflow Coupe, which was a two-door version, obviously shorter wheelbase, I think the styling looks better to me. It looks much more interesting. But this one is rare. As I said, there are only 3 of these left, which is pretty hard to believe. And of course, you have these slats on the side. In the winter, you keep them closed to keep warm air in the vehicle. Since it's summer, we'll open them up right here. There you go. And you can see this car is a senior winner at the Classic Car Club of America, so that's pretty cool. And these are full classics. You know, they're LeBaron bodied. They're, I think this is as exotic as any of the European cars of the period, Delahaye or any of that stuff. And just so different looking. I mean, this was the first truly, at least American aerodynamic car. There were other cars in Europe that were aerodynamic and had a lot of airplane influences. But this one was the first one done in America specifically that way. As I said before, Orville Wright helped develop the wind tunnel. You know, it's funny about the Wright brothers. You always read about them. They were just simple bicycle mechanics that made this airplane. And you know, the Wright brothers were real engineers. They built their own motor. They knew what they were doing. We always have this thing in America to make everybody just a kind of a simple person and, oh, they did this amazing feat. No, they knew what they were doing. They were real engineers. They did some amazing things, and Orville Wright was instrumental in helping develop this car. Come on, let's take it for a ride. And when you want to get some air flowing through it, you just turn the crank here. Voila, instant air conditioning. Look at that. You know, that really is effective. You know, it's one of these features you find really amazing in an old car that there's no way you could possibly have in a modern car. But, you know, side windows are nice, but you don't get that breeze right in your face like you do with this. And you can close it back up again. There you go. Once you get over 25 miles an hour, you lift off and you feel it overdrive kick down and you just cruise. I love those two wings on the front. If you notice, there's wings all over this thing, on the front, on the fender skirts, all over the car. This is probably the most advanced car of the 1930s, at least in America. For some reason, people just didn't take to the styling. It was just too new, too fast. The initial reaction was quite good when they unveiled this at the auto show. What happened was, I guess a lot of people signed up, they took a lot of orders, and they couldn't deliver the cars quick enough. And you know, we Americans, we gotta have it right now, so people just didn't want to wait 2 months or 3 months or maybe even longer, so they just bought something else instead. I have to admit, when you park it next to the 33 Imperial, the previous model, which is much more traditional looking, big chrome radiator, very town car looking body or touring type body on. You know, that's what Prestige looked like back in the day. This was just a little too advanced for most people. And you got freewheeling as well, which means when you let off the throttle, the engine disengages and you just roll. The disadvantage of freewheeling would be okay now because brakes are so good, modern disc brakes and stuff. But in the day, brakes faded fairly quickly, and when you didn't have engine compression braking to slow you down, your brakes fade even more quickly. Chrysler was always the engineering company, you know. Walter Chrysler was a real engineer. I think he was at Maxwell first with Carl Breer and a guy named Skelton and Zender, I think it was, and they were sort of his three musketeers, I think they called them. I'm just going off the top of my head here as I remember it, so if I get it wrong, please correct me in the comment section. But they were the geniuses behind this car, and the design of this car. It must have been heartbreaking for them because they had such high hopes for it. They worked on it a long time, getting the aerodynamics down. You got about 250 foot-pounds of torque, which is more than adequate, and quite impressive for 1934. The thing that made these cars so amazing was how smooth they rode, and the aerodynamics. I mean, its speed, when you came off the throttle, you didn't find yourself hitting a brick wall of air like you did in a lot of the other cars. This thing was probably close to, I don't know, $3,000, $4,000, something like that. I know the CW was $5,000. which was unbelievable at the time. But nice detail work in these things. I'd play the radio for you, but if I did, then I would be sued because I'm on the airways playing somebody's song and I'm not paying royalties, and it's a whole big deal. There's a lot of work to do in these YouTube shows. So many legal things. So you can never play the radio in the car. And like most luxury cars of the period, you got this huge giant heater under the dashboard there with vents that you can open and close and position. Well, as you cannot hear, this engine is very quiet, very smooth. Being a flathead, obviously not a high rever, but plenty of torque. And more than adequate for the job at hand, really. Probably could use some outside mirrors. This thing is so big and long, and looking through this little rear view mirror is really not ideal. I think top speed on these was just a shade over 100 miles an hour, maybe 102, something like that, which means it's more than fine at 70. You know, it's funny, this was done before marketing surveys or Chrysler had such high hopes for this car. They were going to come out in 35, but they're so afraid that General Motors is working on their own aerodynamic car, and maybe Ford was too, and so they rushed it out in 34. That's part of the reason, I think, why maybe it wasn't so successful. They couldn't gear up for the demand at the time, and people went elsewhere. But the whole Chrysler lineup was sort of based on the Airflow concept, and then they sort of pulled back from that once they realized, uh-oh, this thing isn't doing as well as we thought. Plus it was expensive, plus you had a depression. But as you can see, it's just a nice driving car. Take along 5 of your greatest friends and put them in the back there. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little glimpse of the future. The future, if it was 1933, this is what the future was going to look like. Rear aerodynamic cars. But unfortunately, Chrysler was about 50 years too soon. Of course, the Lincoln Zephyr came out and a few others, but none of those made quite the commitment to aerodynamics that Chrysler did. And sadly, they paid the price for it. So, just a little automotive history. Thought you might enjoy it, and let's hope this pandemic ends soon. We'll see you guys next week. Banging them out.
Mm-hmm.